Thank you. I will not waste much time of thanking the two organizers, Sebastian and Julian, for arranging this, but thanks a lot. And they have given me a talk which was something about thermal regulation. And I would say, oh shit, I'm more of a performance guy, so I want to talk about performance. But now Andreas just saved me, saying that changing your exercise intensity is also thermoregulation. So now I can fulfill my duty and also talk a little about regulation of behavior, because that is what I call pacing, and how you pace yourself will affect performance. Also, the two organizers must obviously be somewhat interested in triathlon, since they combine running and cycling. I mean, who would do that? You wouldn't run voluntarily, especially not if it's hot. But I will talk a little bit about this. And my interest started actually with this guy, Torbjørn Sindballe, who is calling himself a Viking. He's from Denmark, and he wanted to do well at Hawaii Ironman. He won the world championship in long duration triathlon several times. But what happens was, when he went to Hawaii, he, so to speak, ran into problems, because while he was cycling, he had the fastest cycling time at Hawaii. If we look at his dissipation of heat to the environment, he releases a little bit of heat by convection and radiation. The environmental temperature is lower than his skin temperature, and because he moves so fast, the convective will remove some heat. But of course he also needed to evaporate some heat, but at this wind speed, the capacity for evaporating all this is so large that he can do so, as long as he produces the sweat. And we calculated that he did so, and we also measured his core temperature during simulated trials at the power output that we knew from his power meter that he would produce. Thermal balance was not a big issue here. What happens then when he starts running? Oh, then he runs into problems. The speed is slower when you run. Therefore, the maximal evaporative capacity of the environment in these conditions is very close to what is actually required that he will dissipate of heat, and therefore thermoregulation and therefore occasionally performance become an issue. And we tried all kinds of stuff, ice in his glue here, all white to minimize radiation that he would achieve from the sun. He put ice in the back and so on. I asked him to lose weight. Now there's one of the next talk will be about running economy. The most efficient is to lose weight, then you will at the same running speed produce less heat. Even though that the sink is good for absorbing some of the heat, it is in the long run the best thing. Now is this only something that occurs for this guy? He was a big guy, and he's from Denmark, which is the blue area on Dr. Narcisse's presentation, so that's where I'm from. And we actually observed this, and there's lots of indicators that that running is affected at temperatures from even 20, I will show you the details, but here's some observations from some of the Danish triathletes competing when they run the marathon in Denmark, Algemera road, which is fast and what we would say cool conditions. They can do their runs in these times here, and we should know that they have been bicycling 180 k's before, so it's not 2 hours and 6 like the elite. But what happens here when it gets hot at Hawaii, it's slight decrease, and this was observations from the best trial ever done at Hawaii for this another Danish triathlete. But here he was competing in China, and now we can address like 40 minutes extra time to the run performance, which was in, I mean, they're crazy over there, 40 degrees competition temperature. But what about the cycling performance? 4 hours and 30. Similar. Of course, there can be tacticals, there can be different routes and so on, and we'll get back to that. So, for running, this is more scientific work. The other was just observations from single athletes. The impact of weather on the same course addressed here by Eli, showing that even for experienced runners, when the environmental temperature is 25, they will perform some 3-4% worse than they do when it's colder than 10 degrees. And if it's less experienced runners, so the less experienced you are, the larger impact it has. So of course, if we go to even higher temperatures, this will become a massive problem. So we observe that for running outside. We observe that for cycling in the lab. This is different kind of study. This was the first study I ever did in collaboration with Dr. Jose Gonzalez, very funny study where we had people exercise until exhaustion, so at a fixed intensity, eliciting VO2 max. And when you exercise in the heat, both when you're dehydrated and normal hydration, your VO2 max is reduced and you perform much shorter time, so time to exhaustion is reduced. Julian Perriard did some studies doing time trials, and when you compare a time trial in the heat with a time trial at a cooler condition, again, power output is markedly decreased, not at the initial of the time trial, but here in the middle, and it takes longer time to complete the time trial. Indoor cycling. Now this is conditioned with high intensity, so you could say, well, what about the prolonged, the 180K where it's lower intensity? Then it's probably other factors, because in these conditions, when you exercise at 60% of VO2 max, your oxygen consumption is not changed, yet you stop exercise at much sooner. This is actually, here we stop them after 1 hour. We know that in these conditions in the control, they can keep on going at this intensity for like 3 hours or something like that, whereas they stop after approximately 50 minutes here in the heat. And I won't go into the discussion of the mechanisms. I'm not here to talk so much about mechanisms today. I can refer to a paper that we wrote together with Dr. Sorka, where we address the different kind of factors, and it's probably integrative. But here's just the observation. In the lab, when you do cycling, you have a massive decrease of performance, both in maximal, high-intensity time trials and submaximal prolonged exercise. And it is associated with an increase in core temperature, which is not present at the same level when you exercise at lower temperatures. These, again, the study that George already presented. Actually, George did most of my presentation for tomorrow, so I will have to figure out something new for the soccer, but I'll probably work that out. Then you could say, is this just a matter of you doing studies in Copenhagen and it's unacclimatized subjects? No, this is a study by Lorenzo and co-workers. That's Santiago for the first name, if you are not familiar with that, Sebastian. And he investigated this both in the cool and in the heat before they were acclimatized and after 10 days of acclimatization. And you can see that getting acclimatized certainly will improve your performance. So the performance decrement from cool to the hot, some of that can be regained when you acclimatize, yet your performance is still lower than it is in a controlled settings. And in these settings, they also changed, so they actually improved their aerobic fitness, so they also performed after the acclimatization. So there's still a performance deficit in the heat. So this will still be an issue even you're acclimatized. Now again, this is lab studies, all of this. Now, as I said, I'm from the blue area, and this is how it looks at least half of the year in Copenhagen. So when we do studies, we move into the lab and we do all kinds of funny stuff there, putting catheters into the jugular vein, into the artery, measuring AV differences across the brain. We measure cerebral blood flow, and of course we need to do so in these types of studies to look at the mechanisms and to get an idea of that. But if we want to know what really goes on in the heat, we need to go into the heat, out of the lab. And many thermal physiologists, they do that. But we tend to do most of our studies in the lab. And if we really want to know, then we need to go out here. So we had the pleasure of last year to bring down 9 cyclists from the blue area, a winter that had been like not that shitty as I showed you on the other picture, but with temperatures below 5 degrees Celsius all winter. So non-acclimatized subjects, bringing them to the heat, doing time trial on day 1, day 6, and on the 13th day. And then we looked at performance. The performance outcome was to complete the course as fast as possible. And it was 43 kilometers flat terrain. We had to choose courses that were as similar as it was possible, but the altitude difference was less than 10 meters. I'm from a flat country. Qatar is also flat here. Then we measured power output by power meters, and this is the average power output in the control pre, 303 watts. Afterwards, we didn't see in these subjects the same performance enhancements as in the Lorenzo study, and there may be many different reasons for that, but these were trained cyclists usually doing time trials and doing high intensity. That was one of the inclusion criteria, that they should be what we thought would be optimal training, doing high intensity training regularly 3-4 times a week, and they should compete in the heat. So no change here. But what happens here? First day in the heat, we went down here and went outside, did a time trial, 15% reduction in power output. Then after 6 days of acclimatization, regain, and after 14 days here, we only were 2% lower than we were in the control trial on average power output. So regarding the question that our statistics wouldn't answer how long time in front should you arrive and so on, you'd say, well, much of the performance enhancements occurs here in the first 6 days. So that is the least you should arrive before if you want to complete. But you should actually come down maybe some 10, 14 days before if you want to have the full acclimatization effect. Let's see if it will change. Now what happens then to performance? And now this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. Now power output goes down with 15%, so of course you will go at slower speed and it will take you longer time to complete the course. But here you can see that after acclimatization, the performance deficit in power output is only 2%, yet you go faster. Or at least you go as fast. When we can measure the time, it is not significantly different, but I know from myself, I was faster. So that's the important thing. Why are you then that? That is because the air density is lower when it's hot. So at a similar power output, you go at a higher speed when it's hot. So yes, you lose some, but if you're acclimatized, this performance deficit can be minimized quite dramatically. Remember that when you do this in inside trials in the Lorenzo studies, the performance power output which they measure, and of course they don't measure speed, because when you cycle inside, your average speed is 0 kilometers an hour all the time. But that, of course, so you don't have the benefit of the lower air density. And it's similar for running. I mean, if you cannot produce the same energy, you cannot have the same, maintain the same exercise intensity, you will run slower. Yeah, you run at the fastest 20 kilometers an hour and you can calculate the wind speed, so they maybe have 0.5% benefit of a higher temperature, whereas here in cycling, because the average speed is above 40 kilometers an hour, you will have a massive improvement from that. Oops, sorry. Now a little bit about thermoregulation, nevertheless, because that is also an issue when you cycle. As I showed you, evaporative cooling is an issue. So we also use this little, and no surprise, no, it doesn't have the same shape as the cyclist. We weight them before and after to estimate sweat rate, just to get an idea how much did they sweat. We calculated their fluid intake and so on. And we measured continuously their core temperature, small boxes here, and we actually also pre and post exercise measured their skin temperature on selected sites. But of course it's very complicated. Should you measure it under the trousers here in front, it will be different, and it is difficult to calculate the total area and so on. And then we also looked at the pacing strategy here. And trying to get an idea, why do you actually slow down here? This is trial 1, average is the 15% lower, and this is trial 2. The funny thing here is, just like in the indoor trials that Julian showed, you start out at the same power output here. I tell you, the first trial you did here, I think, oh, this is going to be easy. I mean, heat, yeah, it's hot, but I can still keep this pacing. But then somewhere into the trial, you get a clue of what's going on, and then you would say to, hey, you have to reduce your pace. You can always say, is this behavioral that you think, well, now I have to reduce, or is it unconscious behavioral responses? Nevertheless, this is what happens in these trained cyclists. They cannot maintain the same power output. Whereas when they become acclimatized, they, for a longer trial, and only with this small performance decrement at the end of the trial, but also here where they have the highest core temperatures, they will perform a little less. And this is the average of the two trials in the cool before and after. Now, looking at the core temperature responses, what happens here, and the interesting is here at the beginning, you do the same power output, whereas here at the end in the unacclimatized is where you lower your power output a lot. Is if we look at this rate of increase, it is largest here in the beginning. So when you still are somewhat at a normal core temperature, at least for an exercise response, and you have the capacity to still store some of the heat, you cannot release all of it. And you can see there's continuous heat storage until here at the end for several of the subjects here, they have lowered their power output so much that it actually matches the heat dissipation that they in the given condition can get. Except for this, and I can tell you he was not having a good time here. At this instant here, I really thought that if I could do the sliding into my blue area, I would have done so. But this is not thermoregulation. This was clearly a loss of thermoregulation. Totally, I stopped sweating and different stuff like that. And we will probably get some data on what's going on there when we analyze the blood. Whereas when you're acclimatized, again, you see the same. Your core temperature keeps increasing throughout the trial with some differences, and also some differences in the end temperature. The temperature that individuals can tolerate at the end are different. But here, you can keep having an increase in because your thermoregulation is better, you dissipate more heat here in the beginning, you still have a capacity to produce power at the end. So all this, that the anticipatory downregulation is due to an increase in core temperature. No, if you have the capacity still to store some of the heat in your body, you can also better maintain the power output that is producing so much heat that you will store some of it. And if we look at the thermal balance here, you can see that the end temperature in all trials are the same. The core temperature here keeps increasing, so you have a delta storage throughout the trial in the acclimatized. In the other one, you have most of your storage in the beginning, very little towards the end. You decrease your heat production so much. If we try to calculate all of this, and I have got the first warning, so I should do this fast. Your metabolic heat production, well, when you complete the course faster, you produce more heat, you produce more power output, then your heat production goes up, and it calculated from the delta efficiency that we measured in the lab on these cyclists. It increases from heat production of 900 watts to 1010 watts. But what also happens is that your sweat rate increases from 2.2 to 2.4, and that, according to the calculations that we've done, allows you to increase your evaporative heat loss from 850 watts to 1010 watts. Then you store some heat in the body, and then you gain a little bit from the radiation from the sun. So you can say even if you're acclimatized and that the increased sweat rate will increase your capacity to dissipate heat, you will perform better. Yet you will still become hot because you will simply produce more heat. You get acclimatized. It allows you to produce more heat. It allows you to complete the course faster. Delta storage throughout the trial calculated is similar because you simply produce that heat faster when you're acclimatized. So, ending here, saying, well, if you do cycling, yes, you will become hot, your power output, but you can do it as fast in the heat. Whereas if you do more primitive types of exercise, sorry for that part, then you will, so to speak, run into problems because you don't have the same convective heat loss. And I can say that I have the pleasure to talk about the soccer studies tomorrow, so it's not that primitive, and it's also interesting to look at primitive exercise forms if you want to know what's going on in the body. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lars, for this very interesting presentation and very interesting recent data. I would like to give the opportunity to the floor for questions.
Thank you for your presentation, Lars, and for that last slide. Very interesting. I was just wondering, you said during the study you did here in Qatar that your subjects came out of a climate of 5 degrees Celsius or less for over a few months, if I understood correctly?
Yeah, they've been living in the winter in Denmark. So
would you say they are at that time cold acclimatized? And would that influence the acclimatization periods they had here, in duration, I mean?
I don't think so. I would say that they are non-heat acclimatized. So when we looked at their sweat, both volume that they produced at a given workload and also here in the time trials, we also did some measurements in the lab. And if we measure sodium content in the sweat as an indicator of, they had various aspects, but all of them got acclimatized through the study. And of course you could say, well, if you're partly acclimatized, if you do some of your, I mean, we ask these guys not to do too much indoor training during the pre-period, because if you just do that, then you are partly acclimatized, and then we wouldn't be able to study. So you can always say it's an issue of how unacclimatized are you at the beginning of the trial. But according from the data that we see, they were unacclimatized because they had this massive improvement in both in the physiological responses that we saw and also in performance.
Any other question from the floor? Yes? Ole?
Thanks for great. That's a great talk, Lars. I just want to ask you a question about your data, the last study that you presented. So the post-acclimatization, it seems that it's an uncompensable heat stress situation, whereas pre-acclimatization, it seems that the participants regulate their metabolic rate to the point where they're in heat balance. Is there anything to suggest that that might be the signal that's been integrated? So if we look at the dotted line, it's flat. That's pre-acclimatization, right? Towards the end.
That's the first trial we did in the heat, yes, so we are not acclimatized there. You can say that in that trial, you also decreased your power output so much that you could say, well, this is not optimal for performance, but it is necessary to, I mean, you could say if you produced more heat there, then there could say two things. Your heart rate was like 10 beats from maximum. So you could say, well, if I exercise any harder, if you give me some of the drugs that Bart would, it would maybe increase it a little bit, but it would also increase my heat production. And you could say, I was hot enough after that trial, and on average, people reached pretty similar temperatures. So you could say if you have exercised any harder than that, then you would have got even hotter, even worse. So you could say, would that have been a catastrophe and so on? No, you can just say that is what happens.
I'm just wondering whether the absolute temperature is something that we are really sensing, or if it's the change. Because the change in core temperature post-acclimatization is much greater, isn't it?
Yeah, but you could say that after, when you are, let's say, 70% into the trial, you have 10 kilometers left, then you have a lower core temperature. That may allow you to exercise that harder, and then you produce more heat, so your core temperature keeps increasing. You can also say, what is the hen and what is the egg here? Is it because you have a lower temperature that you exercise harder and produce more heat, but also when you then exercise harder, then you do produce more heat. And in these conditions, even though you're acclimatized and you sweat more, producing more heat will still drive your core temperature up.
Yeah, I guess what I'm wondering is whether the rate of heat storage of 0 is something that's the stimulus somehow when we're unacclimatized, and that's kind of reset post-acclimatization.
I wish I could take the same approach as Aziz, saying I'm just a statistic. I wouldn't know. But I think this is very complex to say what regulates. What is actually the cause for here? Is it delta storage, or what is? I would just say that at the moment I would say this is behavioral thermoregulation. You downregulate your exercise intensity, so to speak, to match the capacity you have for further heat storage and the capacity you have for dissipating heat to the environment.
Thank you, Lars. Our time's up. Excellent talk.